Joffrey Baratheon, the infamous tyrant of Westeros, was known for his cruelty and short temper. But what if, instead of following the dark path of cruelty and selfishness, Joffrey had been a kind-hearted king? What if the people loved him and he ruled with wisdom, empathy, and strength? Joffrey Baratheon was born into a world already brimming with power struggles and deceit. He was the crown prince, the son of King Robert Baratheon and Cersei Lannister, raised in a house full of political games, manipulation, and ruthless ambition. But as a child, Joffrey was different from what people saw in him. He had moments of tenderness, moments where his compassion surfaced, but they were often hidden beneath his mother's controlling grasp and the expectations of his house. Still, there was something about him, something deep down that yearned for goodness. It was his mother's influence that often darkened his views. Yet, as he grew older, Joffrey began to see the world not as a battleground for his family's power, but as a realm he was meant to protect. He often wandered the streets of King's Landing in disguise, speaking to commoners and learning of their struggles. His heart grew heavy at the thought of their suffering, unlike in the original timeline, where Joffrey tortured those who crossed. This Joffrey listened. He spoke kindly to the beggars, the laborers, and the merchants. He saw the injustice that ran through the city's veins, not as something to exploit, but as something to fix. When the time came for him to ascend the throne, Joffrey had already made up his mind. He would not rule with the same iron fist his mother wanted, nor with the same reckless cruelty his father had been known for. Instead, he would seek to right the wrongs of the kingdom. Cersei, always the manipulative force behind Joffrey's actions, was shocked. "You are the king, Joffrey," she would whisper in his ear. "It is your birthright to rule with strength. Show no mercy." But Joffrey, determined to be different, ignored her. The first major test of Joffrey's leadership came when he had to make a decision on the treatment of the peasants in the outer districts of King's Landing. There had been a drought that year, and crops were failing. People were starving. His advisors urged him to raise taxes on the poor, to make them bear the brunt of the suffering. But Joffrey, with his newfound sense of justice, refused. Instead, he ordered the treasury to provide grain and aid to the starving districts. The noble houses were furious, but Joffrey did not back down. He knew the true strength of a ruler was not in his ability to destroy, but in his ability to heal and build. As Joffrey Baratheon ascended the throne, the people of King's Landing were unsure of what to expect. The court had been accustomed to power plays and cruelty, to a king who ruled with fear. But Joffrey's first decree ordering aid to the outer districts was only the beginning of what would become an unexpected reign. The noble houses of Westeros watched with skepticism as Joffrey began to defy their expectations. Tywin Lannister, the head of House Lannister, and Cersei's father, was not easily impressed. He had built his family's power on a foundation of ruthless ambition and strategic manipulation. He had no intention of letting his grandson undermine the delicate balance of power that had taken years to build. "What is this nonsense, Cersei?" Tywin barked one evening, after hearing of Joffrey's decisions. "A king shows his strength by making others fear him, not by helping peasants. Joffrey needs to understand that power is not earned through kindness, but through dominance." But Cersei, who had always hoped her son would follow in the footsteps of his late father, began to see something different in Joffrey. He was compassionate, yes, but he was also determined. She found herself torn caught between the old way of ruling, the cold, calculating power of the Lannisters, and the warmth of a new era that Joffrey seemed to be creating. Despite Tywin's disapproval, Joffrey pressed on. His policies began to focus on rebuilding the kingdom, not just the capital. He sought to fix the infrastructure, provide food and shelter to the poorest, and encourage trade. His first act outside of King's Landing was to meet with the lords and ladies of the Reach. He knew that securing alliances was vital, but he also understood that his sincerity would be his greatest weapon. When Joffrey addressed the high-born families, he spoke not of his right to rule, but of his duty to serve. "I do not seek to command you as a king," Joffrey said during a meeting at Highgarden. "I seek to lead as one of you. We are all part of this kingdom. I will listen, and I will help. But I ask that you help those in need as well. Let us build this realm together." The nobles were stunned. They had expected a speech of dominance, not one of cooperation. Some were still suspicious, but many were quietly impressed. They had not heard a king speak in such terms before. It wasn't long before word spread. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope among the common people, and even the nobles began to reconsider their view of Joffrey. But this new path was not without its challenges. As Joffrey Baratheon continued to push for reforms and a more just kingdom, not everyone in Westeros shared his vision. His actions were slowly starting to shift the balance of power, and not all the major houses were eager to follow his lead. While some nobility were intrigued, others saw his kindness as a weakness, a flaw that could be exploited. The first test came from House Stark. Robb Stark, the young king in the north, was a man of honor and valor, but his pride was not easily swayed. Despite his respect for Joffrey's determination, Robb had long believed that a king should be a symbol of strength, not kindness. The tension between the North and King's Landing was already high, with rumors of betrayal swirling. Robb had heard stories of Joffrey's new policies, and while some of them seemed admirable, they didn't sit well with the traditional northern values. The North had always prized self-sufficiency and strength. Many felt that Joffrey's reforms, though noble, were too soft. To make matters worse, Cersei continued to whisper in Joffrey's ear, warning him of the consequences of appearing weak in the eyes of the great lords of Westeros. "You are the king, Joffrey," she would say. "You cannot afford to be loved. You need to be feared, or they will destroy you." Joffrey, however, was resolute. He wanted to be remembered as a king who built, not one who destroyed. He sent envoys to Robb Stark, seeking to form an alliance, a partnership of sorts. He offered a deal that would secure peace between the two, allowing the North to remain independent in most matters, while still acknowledging Joffrey's rule as king of all the Seven Kingdoms. But Robb, distrustful of Joffrey's sudden kindness, saw this offer as a trap, an attempt to weaken the North. He rejected Joffrey's proposal outright, believing that to accept would show weakness, something no Stark could ever afford. This refusal set the stage for a larger conflict between the two, one that would test Joffrey's new approach to ruling. The situation worsened when the Ironborn, taking advantage of the growing instability, began raiding the western coast. The people of the Reach and Dorne, fearing for their safety, looked to Joffrey for protection. But his desire for diplomacy and peace conflicted with the demands of war. In his heart, Joffrey knew that violence would only breed more violence, but he was no fool. He understood that a ruler could not simply talk peace while enemies threatened. The kingdom, Joffrey called upon his lords and commanders for counsel. "We must act swiftly to stop the Ironborn," he declared, "but we must do so with honor. We will not burn villages or pillage. Our forces will protect the people and send the message that we stand strong, but we will not lose ourselves in the same darkness that others have." The battle that followed was fierce, But Joffrey's strategy, despite the doubts of many, was surprisingly effective. The Ironborn, who expected a brutal and unforgiving conflict, were met with an army that fought not with blind rage, but with purpose and discipline. Joffrey's forces successfully repelled the invaders, though not without casualties. When the dust settled, many of the lords began to see the true strength in Joffrey's approach. He had not led with cruelty or fear. He had led with honor. He had proven that a king could defend his people without descending into the same chaos that had once plagued his family. But this victory came at a price. The lords of Westeros, especially those with more ruthless ambitions, began to grow wary of Joffrey's methods. They feared that his kindness might be his undoing. They whispered that he was too young, too inexperienced to lead. Even as he proved himself in battle, there were those who plotted against him, those who thought a king who ruled with empathy was a king who would fall easily. Joffrey's reign, though marked by kindness and newfound strength, was not without its enemies, and they weren't all from foreign lands. The greatest threat to his kingdom came from within his own court, the very people who had sworn loyalty to him. It began with a quiet whisper, a rumor that spread like wildfire through the halls of the Red Keep. Cersei Lannister, Joffrey's mother, had always been a force of manipulation. Despite Joffrey's refusal to follow her cold, calculated path, she remained fiercely protective of her family's legacy. At first, she had been supportive of Joffrey's good intentions. But now, after witnessing the growing respect he garnered among the lords and people, her fears began to surface. She feared losing control, not just of her son, but of the kingdom itself. One evening, after the Ironborn had been repelled and the kingdom had momentarily found peace, Cersei called Joffrey to her chambers. She had a plan, one that would secure his reign for good, she said. "You cannot continue like this," she warned him. "You've shown mercy to the common folk and to your enemies, but this kindness will be your undoing. The lords will grow restless. They will turn on you. Power doesn't just come from victory on the battlefield, comes from control. You need to show them who rules." Joffrey, despite his trust in his mother, shook his head. "Mother, I cannot rule through fear. That's not the man I want to be. We can change this world, make it better for the people." But Cersei's words had already planted seeds of doubt in his mind. She had always been the master of manipulation, and her presence in Joffrey's life was a constant reminder of what power could do to a person. The real betrayal, however, came from someone Joffrey had never expected. His own hand, Pettier Baelish, also known as Littlefinger. Baelish had been a trusted advisor to Joffrey, advising him on matters of diplomacy and court politics. Littlefinger had always played both sides, walking the line between helping Joffrey and advancing his own schemes. But now, seeing Joffrey's rise to power and his refusal to be cruel, Littlefinger saw an opportunity. While Joffrey remained focused on reforming the kingdom, Littlefinger began sowing dissent among the noble houses. He whispered in the ears of those who were discontent with Joffrey's rule. He told them that the young king was weak, that he was too kind to rule with strength, and that his lack of decisive action would lead to ruin. Joffrey is a puppet, a child playing at being king, he told the lords in secret meetings. The true power lies with those who know how to control the kingdom. We must act before it is too late. His words found their mark with the ambitious lords who had long sought more power in the realm. The first to be swayed was Lord Varys, the spy master, whose network of whispers had always been a tool for his own survival. While he had initially supported Joffrey's vision, he began to see that the young king's kindness might lead to instability. The realm was on the brink of change, and Varys, ever the opportunist, knew that he would need to choose the winning side. Together with Littlefinger, Varys began plotting to undermine Joffrey. They knew that to dethrone him, they needed to discredit him, turn his supporters against him, and show that a king who ruled with kindness was a king who couldn't keep the realm safe. At the same time, Cersei, sensing that her son's reign was in jeopardy, began to act in secret. She knew that she couldn't let Joffrey fall not when so much was at stake for House Lannister. She began to work behind his back, rallying those in the court who still believed in the old ways of power and dominance. Her whispers were soft, but her intentions were clear. If Joffrey couldn't rule with strength, then she would. While Joffrey remained blissfully unaware of the machinations brewing around him. He had trusted the very people who were now plotting his downfall, convinced that his reforms would be enough to solidify his reign. But with every passing day, the walls closed in. The betrayal was not just coming from those outside his family, but from those closest to him. And as the kingdom began to fracture under the weight of these alliances and plots, Joffrey was forced to realize the harsh truth. Kindness alone wouldn't save him. He had been raised in a world of power, struggles, and deception, and now, to protect his kingdom and his people, he would have to face the darkness within his own court. Joffrey Baratheon's world had always been one of luxury and power, but as his reign continued, he began to understand that the true cost of leadership wasn't measured in gold or lands. It was measured in trust and betrayal. The weight of the crown, which once felt like a symbol of pride, now pressed down on him like a millstone. The whispers had started to reach him, but Joffrey had always dismissed them as rumors, nothing more than the idle chatter of jealous lords. However, as the days went by, the tension in the court grew unbearable. His advisors, once loyal, now offered half-hearted counsel, their eyes darting to the corners of the room, as if to make sure no one was listening. Joffrey's world, which had once seemed so secure, was unraveling bit by bit. It all came to a head when Joffrey received a letter, a simple scroll sealed with a wax emblem he didn't recognize. He opened it, his hands trembling as he read the contents. "Your reign is a joke. You have let the kingdom fall into the hands of fools. Your mother has betrayed you, and your trusted hand, Littlefinger, is plotting your downfall. The realm will soon be divided, lest you act swiftly." The message was clear. Someone knew everything. Someone was watching, and they were warning him that time was running out. Joffrey's mind raced as he tried to process the betrayal. He'd trusted Cersei with his life, but now, in his heart, he knew she had played a part in the scheming against him. But why? Was she truly trying to protect him, as she often claimed? Or had she been working to keep the Lannister family in control, even if it meant tearing down her own son? Littlefinger's betrayal hurt in a different way. Joffrey had seen him as a mentor of sorts, someone who had helped guide him through the murky waters of politics and courtly affairs. But now he realized that Littlefinger had only been using him, making him a puppet in his own power games. Joffrey knew he couldn't wait for the conspirators to strike first. He had to act. But how could he trust anyone? Who could he turn to? His first instinct was to turn to the one person who had always been by his side, his Queen Margaery Tyrell. Margaery, unlike the others, had shown him nothing but kindness and respect, and for a time he believed she genuinely cared for him. She was a breath of fresh air in a world of deceit, but even she had her own loyalties. The Tyrells were powerful, and if they saw Joffrey as a weak king, they would turn on him without a second thought. Joffrey summoned Margaery to his chambers, the tension between them thick as she entered. She stood before him, her face a mask of calm, but Joffrey could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Marguerite," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I need your help. You've heard the rumors. You must know what's happening here." She didn't immediately respond, choosing her words carefully. "I've heard the whispers, yes, but I believe you are still the king. You are the one who commands this kingdom." Joffrey shook his head in frustration. "The kingdom is slipping away from me. My own family is plotting against me, and I'm surrounded by traitors. I need your help, Marguerite. Tell me who I can trust." Marguerite hesitated, her eyes flicking to the door, as if checking to make sure they weren't being overheard. She stepped closer to Joffrey and lowered her voice. "There are those who will always oppose you, Your Grace. But there are also those who will stand with you if you show them the strength to lead." Her words rang in his ears. Strength to lead. That was what he had lacked all along. He had been too kind, too eager to listen to the pleas of the people, too unwilling to wield the ruthless power his enemies had grown accustomed to. He had been trying to build a kingdom of peace, but in doing so, he had forgotten one essential truth. Power was never given, it was taken. "I need to act, Marguerite. I can't let this kingdom fall apart. Not after everything I've done." She placed a gentle hand on his arm, her gaze steady. "You are the king, Joffrey. The crown is yours by right. If you want to keep it, you must stop being afraid of what others think of you. You must show them who you really are, who you really are." Joffrey stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, he realized that kindness alone would not be enough. If he wanted to keep his throne, he would have to take what was his by force. He would have to rule with an iron fist, as his ancestors had done. The decision was made. That very night, Joffrey sent word to his most trusted generals, ordering them to prepare for an immediate strike against the traitors in his court. Littlefinger and Varys would be dealt with swiftly. As for Cersei, he wasn't sure what he would do with her yet. But one thing was certain: no one, not even his own blood, would stand in his way any longer. Joffrey Baratheon had spent much of his reign trying to rule with kindness, listening to the cries of the people, offering mercy where it was needed. But now, after realizing the betrayal lurking within his very court, he had made a decision. That would change everything. No longer would he be the naive prince who sought to win the hearts of all. He would become the king he needed to be, the king who would crush his enemies beneath his heel. The first step was to deal with the traitors in his midst. Littlefinger and Varys had already proven that they would stop at nothing to undermine his authority, so they had to be eliminated. Joffrey had already made his plans. No longer would he sit idly by, waiting for his enemies to strike first. He would take the fight to them. He summoned his most loyal commanders to the Red Keep, and when they arrived, he spoke to them in a voice that left no room for doubt. "The time for games is over," Joffrey said, his tone cold and unyielding. "Littlefinger and Varys are working against me, and I will not allow this treachery to continue. We will deal with them tonight." His commanders nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation, but even they couldn't help but notice the change in the young king. Where once there had been uncertainty, there was now a clear and unwavering resolve. Joffrey was not the same boy who had ascended to the throne. He had become something far more dangerous. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the Red Keep, Littlefinger and Varys were already plotting their next move. They had long suspected that Joffrey might turn on them, but they had underestimated just how quickly he would act. The spy master Varys, had heard whispers of Joffrey's plans, but by the time he had attempted to reach out to his agents, it was too late. The king's command had already been issued. That night, as the moon hung high in the sky, Joffrey's soldiers moved swiftly and silently through the corridors of the Red Keep. They knew where their targets were, and they had orders to capture them alive if possible. Littlefinger, ever the schemer, had hidden himself behind a web of lies and deceit. But Joffrey's men were too skilled, too loyal. They found him first, lurking in a shadowy corner of the keep. Before he could react, they had him bound and gagged, dragged through the halls like a common criminal. Varys, too, was caught in the same fashion, his network of spies and whispers no match for the king's forces. Joffrey watched as the two men were brought before him in the throne room. They looked battered, desperate, and for the first time they could see the man they had underestimated. "Did you think I was blind to your schemes?" Joffrey asked, his voice sharp like a blade. "You thought you could play me for a fool, pull the strings behind my back, and I wouldn't notice. You were wrong, Littlefinger. Ever the opportunist tried to talk his way out of it. Your Grace, this is all a misunderstanding. I was only ever trying to help you, to guide you in the ways of power." Joffrey's eyes narrowed. "Help me, or help yourself. You've been working behind my back, playing both sides, trying to control my kingdom. You're a coward, Petty or Baelish, and Varys, you're no better. You've done nothing but plot and scheme for your own gain." He stood up from the Iron Throne, his expression cold and resolute. "You both will pay the price for your treachery." With a single command, his guards pulled the two men away. The decision had been made. No trial, no mercy. It was the end for Littlefinger and Varys. They had underestimated Joffrey, and now they would pay for it. But as they were dragged away, Joffrey couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line. He had always tried to be different from the kings who had come before him, those who ruled with cruelty and fear. But now, with blood on his hands, he wondered if he had become just another tyrant. The throne was his, but at what cost? Later that night, alone in his chambers, Joffrey stared at his reflection in the mirror. The boy he had been, the one who dreamed of a better world, was slipping away. In his place stood a king who had taken what was his, no matter the cost. But even as the weight of his decisions pressed down on him, he knew there was no turning back. He had to rule with strength, with decisiveness. The kingdom depended on it. The traitors had been dealt with, but there would be more challenges ahead. His enemies would not rest. They would always be watching, waiting for him to slip. Joffrey's reign was far from secure. In fact, it had only just begun. The echoes of Littlefinger and Varys' execution reverberated through the halls of the Red Keep, a stark reminder of the price Joffrey Baratheon had paid to secure his reign. The nobles of Westeros watched with bated breath, some in approval, others in fear. The king had shown his strength, but in doing so, he had also demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice anything, even his humanity, to hold on to power. At first, the people of King's Landing were divided. Some hailed Joffrey as a hero, a king who was unafraid to deal with traitors. They saw his actions as necessary to protect the kingdom from further scheming and chaos. But for many, the brutality of the executions left a bitter taste in their mouths. The streets, once filled with whispers of hope under his reign, now murmured with fear. Joffrey's change had not gone unnoticed. Cersei, always calculating, watched her son from the shadows, though she had pushed him toward a harsher path. Even she could not hide the discomfort in her eyes as she saw the transformation in him. The boy she had raised with love, albeit manipulation, was now something else entirely, and it worried her. "You've made your point, Joffrey Cersei," said one evening as she approached him in the throne room. "But do you understand what this means for you? The people may fear you, but fear can only carry you so far." Joffrey, seated upon the Iron Throne, looked at his mother. His face was set, the weight of the crown and his decisions evident. In his eyes, "I did what had to be done, Mother. They would have destroyed me if I hadn't acted. But there will be consequences," she warned. "Those who fear you now will begin to plot against you. You've made enemies within the court, and some of those enemies are more dangerous than you realize." Joffrey's grip tightened around the arms of the throne, his fingers white from the tension. "I'll deal with them as I dealt with Littlefinger and Varys. They all underestimate me." Cersei's expression hardened. "You underestimate the power of alliances. You've fractured the trust of many houses. And you've forgotten one thing. Joffrey, the throne may be yours by blood, but it's not yours by loyalty. You need their loyalty, or they will tear you down." Joffrey didn't answer. His mind was already racing, calculating the next steps. He had done what he thought was necessary to secure his reign, but now the consequences of his actions were starting to become clear. Across Westeros, the nobility was in turmoil. The execution of two of the most influential men in the kingdom had shaken the foundations of the court. The lords and ladies who had once been hesitant to challenge Joffrey were now openly questioning his fitness to rule. Even House Stark, still wary of Joffrey's actions, began to grow restless. Robb Stark, who had once rejected the idea of an alliance, was now considering the potential threat Joffrey posed to the north. The Tyrells, too, began to reassess their relationship with the king. Margaery, who had once stood by Joffrey's side, began to question his methods. The spark of doubt in her eyes, which had once been filled with genuine affection, was now replaced with uncertainty. In the shadow of the Red Keep, a new movement began to take shape, one led not by the lords or the powerful houses, but by the common people. They had once rallied behind Joffrey's vision of a better kingdom, but the executions and the bloodshed had pushed them to the edge. Whispers spread like wildfire through the streets of King's Landing. The king was becoming a tyrant, just like the ones who had ruled before him. Joffrey, once adored by the people, was now feared and reviled in equal measure. The common folk, who had once seen him as a beacon of hope, now feared for their lives. If he could execute his own advisers without hesitation, what would he do to them? In the quiet corners of the kingdom, the seeds of rebellion began to take root. Small uprisings, though initially squashed by the king's forces, began to gain momentum. It wasn't long before word reached Joffrey's ears that the people, no longer willing to accept his rule, were beginning to rise up. But what hurt most of all was the betrayal from within. Margaery, his queen, had begun to distance herself. The conversations that had once been filled with affection and trust were now strained, and Joffrey could feel the cold distance between them. Her loyalty was in question, and that was something he could not afford. Joffrey paced the halls of the Red Keep, alone in his thoughts. He had built his reign on power, on strength, but he had forgotten the most crucial element of leadership: the need to inspire loyalty, not just fear. His kingdom, once united under the idea of a better future, was now teetering on the edge of collapse. He had done what he thought was right, what he thought was necessary, but in the process he had lost sight of the very things that made him king. Now Joffrey faced the consequences of his actions: a fractured kingdom, distrust among the noble houses, and a people who had once looked up to him, now questioning whether he was any different from the kings of the past. Joffrey had won the battle for the throne, but in doing so, he had lost the support that would keep him there, and now the true test of his reign was beginning. Joffrey Baratheon sat on the Iron Throne, his once imposing presence now a shadow of what it had been. The whispers had grown louder, and no matter how tightly he clenched the throne beneath his fingers, he couldn't silence them. The kingdom was unraveling. His strength, which had once seemed unshakable, now felt like a brittle facade, and he could feel the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. The rebellion had begun to take shape. Small factions across the 7 kingdoms, angry at the bloodshed and tyranny that Joffrey had brought with his rule, were organizing, quietly preparing for a showdown. But the most dangerous of them all was the rebellion brewing in the heart of King's Landing itself. The common folk, long oppressed, were now beginning to rise against the nobility and against Joffrey. For days, Joffrey had been receiving reports of protests in the streets. The people who had once cheered for him now threw rotten food at his soldiers and demanded his removal from the throne. His attempts to placate them had failed miserably. The royal guard had become overburdened, and the city was becoming more volatile by the hour. Cersei, ever the strategist, had been trying to hold the fractured pieces of her son's kingdom together. She came to him one night in his chambers, her face a mix of concern and frustration. "Joffrey," she said, her voice low, "you've lost them. The people no longer fear you, they hate you. And the lords, they are turning against us. We cannot maintain control like this." Joffrey looked at his mother, his eyes dark with exhaustion and regret. "I thought fear would make them respect me," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "But it's made them hate me instead. I've lost everything." Cersei's lips pressed together in a tight line. "You've lost their love, yes, but you can still hold on to their fear. You have the power to crush them before they can rise up, Joffrey. But you must act quickly." Her words stung, reminding Joffrey that everything he had built was based on fear. He had never truly earned loyalty and lay submission, and now it was slipping through his fingers. That night, as Joffrey lay awake, unable to sleep, his mind raced. He knew what he had to do, but it would require him to make a choice, whether to continue down the path of cruelty and tyranny or to acknowledge the people's suffering and try to change before it was too late. He had been given a chance to be different, to rule with compassion, but now he had no idea how to undo the damage he had caused. The next morning, Joffrey summoned Margaery to his chambers. She entered, her face a mask of composure, but the distance between them was undeniable. He could feel it in the air. "I've lost everything, Margaery," he said, his voice breaking. "The people, the lords, even my own family, they don't trust me. I've alienated everyone." Margaery remained silent for a moment, studying him carefully. Then her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "You've shown us your strength, Joffrey, but strength isn't enough. You have to show us that you care about the people, not just about holding on to power. You've done things I never thought you were capable of, but now you have to decide who you want to be." Joffrey felt the weight of her words. In the silence that followed, he realized that she was right. The throne he sat upon wasn't worth losing everything for. He had built his reign on fear, but now he saw the cost. It wasn't just his enemies he had to worry about, it was the very people he was supposed to protect. He had wanted to change the kingdom, but in doing so, he had lost the very people he had sworn to serve. But even as he came to this realization, there was no easy way forward. His enemies were closing in. The rebellion in the streets of King's Landing was growing bolder by the day, and the noble houses, still angry at his actions, had started to discuss his removal. Robb Stark had been quietly rallying support in the north, and House Tyrell was beginning to consider its next move. Joffrey had no choice but to act. He could not afford to let the rebellion grow any larger. He needed to regain control quickly and decisively. But as he prepared for the final confrontation, something inside him shifted. The king who had once sought power at any cost was now realizing that power alone would not save him. He had to find a way to rule with both strength and compassion. But would the kingdom accept such a king now? Was it too late for redemption? The rebellion finally reached its breaking point when a group of dissidents, fueled by the suffering of the people, stormed the gates of the Red Keep. Joffrey's forces, already stretched thin, clashed with the growing mob in a brutal confrontation. The streets of King's Landing ran red with blood as the king's soldiers fought to hold their ground. In the chaos, Joffrey made his way to the front lines, the throne now just a distant memory. He stood before the gates, looking out at the angry mob, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the kingdom slipping from his grasp. But then, he made a choice. Joffrey turned to his captain. "Open the gates," he ordered. The captain hesitated, shocked. "Your Grace, you can't do it," Joffrey commanded, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "Let them in." As the gates creaked open, Joffrey stepped out into the open, his face determined. He walked into the heart of the mob, his soldiers watching warily from behind. The crowd, filled with anger and fear, fell silent as the king approached them. "I know what you've suffered," Joffrey said, his voice clear. "I have failed you, and for that I am sorry. But I will not let this kingdom burn. I will make things right. Together we can rebuild this realm. If you will stand with me, I will fight for you, for all of you." The silence that followed was deafening. The mob, once furious, began to murmur. For the first time, Joffrey saw a flicker of hope in their eyes. But the path ahead was unclear. Joffrey had made his stand. Now, all he could do was wait to see whether his kingdom would accept his plea for redemption or whether it was too late to change the course of history. The silence that hung over King's Landing was thick, almost suffocating. Joffrey stood before the angry mob, his heart racing as he waited for a response, unsure of what would happen next. It felt as if the entire world had stopped, the tension hanging in the air like a storm about to break. For a moment, no one moved. The soldiers behind him stood, poised for action, ready to defend their king at any cost. But Joffrey didn't move. He couldn't. This was his last chance, his one moment to prove that he wasn't just a ruler by right, but a ruler by merit, by the love of his people. Then it began. A single voice, low and uncertain, rose from the crowd. You're not like the others." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Another voice joined in, then another. Soon, the once angry mob was murmuring, debating amongst themselves. They had expected cruelty, more bloodshed, but instead, they had been met with something they hadn't seen from Joffrey before: humility. Joffrey stood tall, his heart pounding in his chest as he continued to speak. "I have failed you. I've let power and fear blind me to what matters most: the people of this kingdom. I cannot undo the wrongs I've committed, but I can promise you this: I will fight for you. I will rebuild this realm, not with the weight of fear, but with the strength of unity." The crowd, once divided, was now shifting. Some eyes filled with skepticism, others with cautious hope. Joffrey knew that he had a long way to go before they would fully trust him again, but this was the first step. The rebel leaders, those who had incited the unrest, looked at each other. Their gaze lingered on Joffrey, unsure whether this was the beginning of a true change or just another attempt to manipulate them. One of them, an older man with a weathered face, stepped forward. "You say you want to rebuild this kingdom," he said, his voice steady but not without suspicion. "But how do we know this isn't another lie? Another attempt to keep us in chains?" Joffrey met the man's eyes, his voice unwavering. "I understand your doubt. I've given you plenty of reasons to distrust me. But I am asking for one. More chance. One chance to prove that I can be the king this kingdom needs. The crowd was still hesitant, but the sentiment was shifting. It wasn't just the promise of power that swayed them, but the way Joffrey had changed in front of them. The cruel and unpredictable king they had feared was gone. In his place stood a man, uncertain and broken, but willing to do whatever it took to heal the wounds of the kingdom. But Joffrey knew it wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges, betrayals, and struggles ahead. His rule wasn't secure, far from it. The noble houses, who had long awaited an opportunity to move against him, were already discussing the next steps in their power plays. Robb Stark in the north, the Tyrells in the Reach, even the Ironborn in the Western Isles, they all had their eyes on the prize, and they were already making their moves. Cersei, though still loyal to her son, watched from the shadows, the glimmer of ambition in her eyes. She had always wanted power, and now, with Joffrey's moment of weakness, she saw an opportunity to secure the Lannister legacy, her legacy. As Joffrey returned to the Red Keep later that night, alone with his thoughts, he realized the full weight of what had just transpired. The people of King's Landing, for all their hatred and fear, had given him a chance. He had to take that chance, no matter what it cost him. But the road ahead would be long. The trust that had been shattered could not be rebuilt overnight. His enemies would not forgive him easily, and neither would the people. His every move would be watched, judged, and scrutinized. He would have to prove himself, not just through words, but through action. Every decision, every policy, every word he spoke would be weighed carefully. One mistake, and it would all come crashing down. In the days that followed, Joffrey made every effort to keep his promises. He sent envoys to the lords of Westeros, offering peace to those who had once rebelled against him. He listened to the common folk, not as a king ruling from above, but as someone who genuinely sought to understand their struggles. He worked to repair the broken alliances, reaching out to the Tyrells and the Starks in an attempt to bring stability to the realm. He even made small efforts to ease the burden on the poor, something he had never thought to do before. But not all of his actions were met with acceptance. Many of the lords were still wary of him, questioning his newfound humility. Some saw it as weakness, while others believed it was too little, too late. Marguerite, ever the political figure, watched closely. While she had seen a glimmer of change in him, she also knew how fragile that change could be. For Joffrey, the struggle was far from over. He had won a temporary reprieve from the people, but the lords of Westeros and his own family were not so easily swayed. Every day he faced the hard truth that being a good king was not as simple as ruling with strength or fear. It was about earning the loyalty of the people, earning their trust, and that was something that took time. As he sat in the throne room, looking out over the kingdom that was slowly, painfully beginning to heal, Joffrey realized that the journey to redemption would not be quick, but in his heart, he knew one thing for certain. This was his chance, to be the king he had always dreamed of being, and he would fight every day, with every ounce of strength he had to make it happen. But whether the kingdom would accept him, or whether he would ultimately be remembered as the king who fell, from grace only time would tell. The story of Joffrey Baratheon was far from over, it had only just begun.